I am a product in part of a lot of different things. You call me an amalgam or whatnot, a mutt, but part of it was my West Point experience for 4 years, which I completed, and then 3 years active duty in the Army. Part of that time, or most of it, in Germany, West Germany. So I'd like to take a few minutes to mention some things. How did it happen that I went to West Point, and what is West Point really? I maintain it is not a college, but a 4-year boot camp, first of all. I consider myself, first of all, an unlikely candidate for West Point, and to have graduated, so to speak, to have completed it, the 4 years of training. I'll go into a few particulars. First, although West Point had people from all races, all creeds, and in some ways a variety of countries, still, my background was quite different than your average bear or bearess there. For instance, my mother was born and raised in Europe until the age of 12. At age 2, she became a person displaced from Eastern Poland. The Russians were coming, and she had 24 hours to evacuate with her 4 siblings and mother on a covered wagon and horse, and they trekked across Poland. At age 12, she came by way of a 2-week boat trip to America by way of Ellis Island in New York State. My mother didn't know any English, found it difficult, and landed in Detroit after Ellis Island. She spoke only German in an enclave in eastern Poland. The entire family was from a small farming village of 2,000, and her father was fighting in a variety of wars across Europe at the time when she was 2 years old. My mother, being a very artistic sort, very empathetic, and very intuitive, and again, raised on a farm early on, gravitated toward promoting you might say, the artistic side of me, and my father in ways more the literary and academic side. He recognized, of course, in today's world, many a person definitely should consider the nuts and bolts of how to make a living, you might say. Although there is a book, and I haven't read it yet, to the tune of Real Artists Don't Starve. I'll have to dive into that. At any rate, at age 7, I took up the violin, asked my mother about it, and she plugged me into at any rate, at the age of 7, I asked my mother if I could take violin lessons, and soon I was then enrolled at age 7 in a Suzuki violin program with a graduate student in North Carolina. A few years later, we had moved to Minnesota, and I took up more lessons at the MacPhail Center for Music in Minneapolis. And my poor mother would drive me there once or twice a week for several years, often on slippery roads, you can't believe, 45 minutes each way. My mother, also to her credit, at age 5 or so, she stopped working and was always in the home and looking after me and my newly arrived sister in North Carolina. This was after 4 years in Detroit. My first 4 years in Detroit, that is, my grandmother looked after me. She knew only German, and she did not speak any English, and so we did not communicate. And at the dinner table, it was with my grandparents and I, no English. I couldn't understand what was being spoken. And then there were other relatives on the farm area also. At age 10, I started taking up a literary bent, started a diary club in elementary school so that I, amongst other things, could read other girls' journals. That was interesting. I had several members. At age 14, I took up writing more for myself and to make profit, and sold 5 articles in one summer for over $500 to ham radio magazines. After, at age 12, I had knocked on a local ham radio operator's door, seeing a big antenna atop his roof. Asked him if he could help me get my ham license, and at age 12, I was off and running in that department. And he took me all over St. Paul, Minnesota, getting used tube-type equipment. I would have to say then, in many ways, I didn't fit in so well. As per my cultural upbringing and some of the very low income areas we lived in, I was raised by a very kind, loving grandmother and mother, but the income area, so to speak, we were in often was rather oriented differently, including my kindergarten experience in inner city Detroit, where nearby homes had bars on the windows to protect from burglaries and more. All of my summers, age 6 or 7 until 15, were spent on my grandparents' farm and other individuals also. Very interesting experience. I could go into more, but not now. Now, I would mention that my father also has had a profound effect upon me. He was always interested in photography, writing. He had and still has a PhD in English literature from a school of some noteworthiness in North Carolina. At any rate then, at age 10, I also took up photography at his behest and kind of copycatting him. You might say the apple often doesn't fall far from the tree. And so, age 10, the journal club, so to speak, and photography. Age 12, though, my own direction with ham radio. I'll just state then that this is part and parcel of why I read poetry at West Point, collected a number of religious books, read a little bit of them, received religious counseling as a senior at West Point from a lieutenant colonel, chaplain there, who often spoke at the cadet chapel, and participated in several religious groups and gave violin concerts often with a fellow cadet there. My bookcase was packed with so many religious-oriented books, often quite deep in manner, philosophical and more. I suppose some people were wondering if I was going to be a chaplain one day. Indeed, my second summer at West Point, it was a location called Camp Buckner, and I remember one Sunday helping a local chaplain with some of his duties there. Additionally, one of my summer assignments, which required a considerable amount of preparation weekly before the summer, was as a cadet peer counselor. Now, one very formative experience, I went to kindergarten in inner city Detroit, and yet a year later, not meeting the qualification criteria for first grade, I had a year off. And everyone else basically in school or too young, I spent almost all day, every day in the woods of the Chapel Hill, North Carolina area, which was not really built up at the time. That was about 1966 and a few years more. We spent several years there in North Carolina then. And I had to think many years passed to come to the word sometimes used for such a person if they develop this area more, a shaman, in that they, quote, go to the forest and spend time observing nature and can handle being alone with their thoughts quite well. I had no boombox, no radio, no sources of distraction, just me and nature all day long. And so I would come home, sometimes to my mother's consternation, with box turtles. And then, of course, we would have to have a box for them and get lettuce. I'd do plaster casts of animal tracks. I'd bug the biology teacher a few years later to help me understand field manuals that were too complex for me. I, at age 6, had my grandmother, she came to visit once from the Detroit area by Greyhound bus alone, and I pestered her for a book on birds. You would click on this little magnetic dial and it would show a new bird. I was fascinated. I collected crayfish. My mother took me fishing once and I caught nothing. That was the end of that a few years later. But at any rate, also I caught snakes by sneaking up behind them and grasping their, I don't know, you call it neck, behind their heads. I don't think my mother was too enthused about that. Finally, when I had to do business in the woods, I used leaves, if you know what I mean. Additionally, I remember once going to a little country store, buying hot dogs, and getting matches that I fibbed about to get at age 10 then in North Carolina again, and had my own little campfire out there. I had been part of the young Boy Scouts Webelos. Now, age 12 to 16, the family packed up and went to a small town of 2,000 in the middle part of Minnesota, and my father obtained a home on the end of a small lane right on a rather significant lake, at least to me anyway. We didn't have a boat, but it was fun. And in the winter, I would walk across in the snow. To go to high school, that was a 3/4-mile trek in snowmobile boots each way and parka with hood. 20 degrees weather come springtime was short-sleeve shirt weather and getting on the bikes. It was spring. We had a large Irish setter too that collected ticks like you can't believe and got quite large, in fact. My mother would pick those off by the dozens every day. It was quite something else. And I would ride my bicycle 5 miles each day to my bosom buddy, so to speak, my best friend, out there in the countryside. And that went on age 12 to 16. Now, age 12 to 16, the family packed up and went to a small town of 2,000 in the middle part of Minnesota, and my father obtained a home on the end of a small lane right on a rather significant lake, at least to me anyway. We didn't have a boat, but it was fun, and in the winter, I would walk across in the snow. To go to high school, that was a 3/4-mile trek in snowmobile boots each way and parka with hood. 20 degrees weather come springtime was short-sleeve shirt weather and getting on the bikes. It was spring. We had a large Irish setter too that collected ticks like you can't believe and got quite large, in fact. My mother would pick those off by the dozens every day. It was quite something else. And I would ride my bicycle 5 miles each day to my bosom buddy, so to speak, my best friend, out there in the countryside. And that went on age 12 to 16. At age 16, our family moved to Kentucky, upon which time, a year later, I found myself playing weekly on a Tuesday night at a local college orchestra as the only high school member, and also every Saturday for a year taking violin lessons at the local urban university from a professor. And that was quite challenging. And then on Sundays, I was playing every Sunday for 3 hours in the afternoon in the Central Kentucky Youth Symphony Orchestra. And the orchestra leader would fly in special to conduct this orchestra every weekend, Sundays that is, from Atlanta, Georgia. We were slated, and the orchestra did in fact go to Russia at the end of this year that I was there. I remember selling candy bars door to door, in fact, in the community I lived in, to do my part to raise monies for the trip. But then at the last minute, I opted out and instead went to West Point, which began my new journey then in life, in many a way, shape, and form. My father had been in the Air Force, by the way. At age 17, he quit high school, joined the Air Force, went to Korea, got out, later wished he could join up again, but they declared he was too thin, weight-wise, that is. So at any rate, when I was in 8th grade, he started to talk about West Point and how it might be neat if I went there. And he would mention it every once in a while. I, though, was interested in medicine like you can't believe. In Minnesota, in a small town, for instance, there was a physician, a family doc, you could call it. And I was quite taken with him, I don't know, the image of him, and Marcus Welby, MD, the TV show. This would come up years later when I had to figure out that I was going to have to remodel my dream and eventually move on. At age 35, in fact, that was when that dream ended. At any rate then, I wanted so badly to go to medical school, but I had some other areas of interest too. Was also interested in the violin, in fact, so strongly that by my senior year, that I was practicing 2 hours a day, 7 days a week, on top of the violin lessons on Saturdays, community orchestra, or rather college orchestra in the town I was in Tuesdays, and the symphony orchestra on Sundays. So I had decided I was going to pursue to become a concert violinist. And my senior year, my father kind of nipped that in the bud or whatnot, said, if I go into music, he won't give 1 cent to me toward my education to further it. I just folded then or thought differently. My option became the fallback compromise to become a physician in the Army or the military. And that's what I did. I went to West Point and became a pre-med student, which then changed as my grades had changed after a year's time, went south, that is. I didn't have an idea, a clue, what the military life was like. I didn't have a clue as to what I was getting into. In fact, I was raised in a rather small, unusually, well, I don't know what the word is, Plymouth Brethren Church. And I was not allowed to date, in fact, until 18 when I left high school and went on my own. Additionally, I had played really no sports except for golf and a little running in high school. And again, I was an immigrant child, so to speak. It was a very difficult set of experiences, and I was totally unprepared for what I was getting into, along with what you might call a handicap in this situation of being extremely thin, frail, if you will. Now, being thin or even frail is not a big deal if you're going to be a medical doctor per se, but it is perhaps in the Army. So, it takes all types of people to make the world go round, and sometimes a little bit of flavor there that's a little unusual. So, I might have been a very unusual bird at West Point. In many a way, shape, and form. You might call me an enigma to some or many, perhaps. But again, we were all very busy there, too. So when most cadets were finished with the dinner at the dinner table, 10 cadets to a dinner table, in a mess hall that had all 4,400 of us, I would pack up my books and go to the library till 10 minutes before lights out at the barracks, 11 p.m. That went on all 4 years. Additionally, I was one of the few cadets who never went to a single football game other than the Army and Navy football games that we would take buses to at a specific location. In fact, I remember the last game, I exchanged uniforms with a naval cadet and came back dressed as a naval cadet, much to the confusion of some people. In fact, one person said this was a form of lying, an interesting conclusion. I quickly changed uniforms back to West Point cadet status. Now, I'll mention a few names of some people who maybe don't always fit the mold, and I draw no allusions to myself as to where I've gotten in life or not, or comparisons, but I do remember there are some unusual people who were in the Army, across the world for that matter. I remember, for instance, General Bradley. He was General of the Army once. Our cadet group I was in marching one day, I marched 3 feet by him when he was in a wheelchair, rather infirm in old age, with a blanket on him. He was an unusual bird in some respects, some say. Also, a newscaster, Walter Cronkite, interestingly, did art on the side, and he, in fact, had some of it published later in time. Then, in World War II, there was a general who was rather unusual, and interestingly, quite respected around the world, even though not on America's side, shall we say. And interestingly, I stumbled across a month ago the fact, as one put it, that his father rather forced him into the military when the son had wanted to become a airplane engineer. I suppose now you would call it aeronautical engineering. And so he was of a different mold there. There was also, interestingly, the writer Edgar Allan Poe, who spent, I don't know, maybe 1 year at West Point, and then he was rather ejected, shall we say. Interesting. I myself wanted to leave West Point about 3 months into the academic year at my first year there, called my father, told him so, and he said, if you quit, don't come home. Well, what is quitting, of course, versus cutting your losses? I was getting a D in my boxing class, and I figured I wouldn't get into West Point's later training, or shall we say their funding of medical school, with that kind of a grade on my record. In fact, the next PE course after 10 weeks of boxing was gymnastics. I also got a D in that. It was not easy for a guy like me. For instance, I flinched so much, was so thin, I was required to take additional boxing lessons after academic classes, boxing one hand behind my back, trying to get me to stop flinching. And as per my body type, tallness, I had to take special posture training with an officer, maybe a captain, with mirrors on all three sides of me, studying my posture and him making comments. Well, it didn't stick too well. Interestingly, I had two roommates each of my 2 semesters my first year at West Point. One of the first roommates that first semester was a football player on the West Point football team. And ironically, he was arriving there at the age of 21 when the average cadet started, myself included, age 18. He had first been a football player on another college, well, a regular college team, let's just call it a college, in Indiana. And then he left, came to West Point to continue. So he was very instrumental in helping me. In fact, one day when I wanted to leave so badly, he went to the administration of West Point and asked a person there how he could get information to help his roommate better the odds of going to medical school, given my D in boxing and suing. My parents almost became missionaries for the Plymouth Brethren Church in Canada. That had a profound influence on my life. For instance, I was not allowed to date until age of 18, and it had a profound influence on how we regarded money also. We did not have much, and in fact, I did not sleep on a conventional bed until the age of 12. And so that was a very interesting influence in many a way. I also did not play conventional sports except for golf in high school a few years, and this limited things in a number of other ways too. I was allowed to watch maybe 1 hour of television a week. They hadn't had video games at that point in time, by the way, and no cell phones, no computers. But at any rate, the one show I was allowed to watch was The Waltons, once a week. I might add, by the way, that my parents once went out for the evening when I was 12 years old. There was no babysitter for me, and so I watched what I wanted finally, other than The Waltons, and I watched a movie called The Andromeda Strain, and I had nightmares occasionally for years after that one show. So much for anything but The Waltons then, but not the ideal television movie to watch, for me especially. There are also some significantly interesting people who were also Plymouth Brethren. A man named Suelo, for instance. There are also some interesting persons who have been Plymouth Brethren in the past, who made some impact or notoriety. Suelo, for instance, S-U-E-L-O, he had been raised in the Plymouth Brethren Church, and then a gentleman wrote a book on him and his life. It was about, I think the subtitle, The Man Who Lived Without Money. He had left a princely sum of his monies, $50 in a telephone booth out west, I believe Utah, and lived 10 years or so without money. Also, Garrison Keeler of Prairie Home Companion had also been raised Plymouth Brethren. And that had an influence on my life to the extent that I had a lot of religious questions and trauma in my life, beginning at West Point especially. Very consternated, the clash of values and so on. And in fact, I bought tons of books, received some counseling there as a senior from the senior chaplain. And that had a profound impact upon me, being a Plymouth Brethren. A Plymouth Brethren, by the way, is very similar to a Plymouth Brethren, by the way, is very similar to the Amish, Mennonites, or Quakers. And in fact, my grandfather, whom I spent time with each summer at the dinner table, he had been a Plymouth Brethren individual, sang in an ethnic choir for years, had not Plymouth Brethren, but Mennonite records, and so this was a very interesting background. He was born and raised, by the way, in Ukraine, Odessa, Ukraine. So in fact, I have the strong background of being a Mennonite, in fact, and my mother, in fact, attended once a Mennonite church for 10 years, and I've been to 3 or 4 different congregations, half a dozen services total myself. I've also been to 3 different Amish auctions. I've also been to 3 Amish auctions. Now, the Army and West Point's training for my future then later in combat arms as a tanker, first as a platoon leader in Germany for several years, involved a lot of time in nature. I suppose that part of it I really liked. We would go off on maneuvers for several weeks at a time, every couple months in Germany. And at West Point, especially in the summers, there was a lot of time in the woods, in their 18,000 acres or more in New York on the Hudson River area. I remember, for instance, my first summer there, Beast Barracks training. We were required to do orienteering, go through the area, mountainous, forested, with a map and compass. I got lost, found a civilian house, knocked on the door, asked, "Where am I?" They had no clue. They didn't know where they were either, really. That was quite a challenge. A friend of mine, in fact, also got lost during that same summer a year later, doing the same kind of thing in the same area, but he was on the cross-country team, and so he got 10 miles off track. It took them a day to find him, and him in turn, civilization. He later, though, went on to become a lawyer in Manhattan for intellectual property rights. So I think he got a clue in some direction how to orient himself on the map, shall we say. This always would come to ring true for me later then, the love of nature. In my 30s, I spent some time studying with the New York Institute of Photography and spent quite a sum of money on film and camera equipment, including medium format. A lot of time spent also. Lots of time traveling in Kentucky doing this type of photography, with a fiance at the time especially. Then at age 37, this again rearing its head, so to speak, in my life, I packed my bags into 2 duffel bags, hopped on Greyhound and went some 300 miles at least to a tiny village near the Mississippi River on the Iowa and Illinois border, but inside Illinois. 800 people rented a place, $100 a month, and had no car all 4 years. Very fascinating experience. I did a lot of time writing, photography, and reading. I remember babysitting dried beans I would cook every afternoon. And that was a very formative experience. And I had some very dear friends there as a result also. That was my version then of a Walden experience. I showed up, knew no one there when I arrived. Again, got there by Greyhound bus, hitchhiked 5 miles from the Greyhound station to the tiny village, and had one book with me. It was Walden. Not to equate myself with Henry David Thoreau in every way, shape, or form, but I was trying to replicate that to a degree and figure out who in the world I was, how I ticked, and what more I wanted, and to do more of my thing, myself that is. After 4 years of that then, I moved on back to Kentucky, closer to my mother, 50 miles from her then, Berea College area, where I spent 4 years as a community member taking classes, all 8 semesters worth at a half-time level, almost all in mathematics, and tutored 10 hours a week at their math department, 3 out of 4 of those years to pay back in toto the tuition. But I didn't receive a degree there. As a community member, that was part of the agreement. So I had rented a converted garage and lived there for 4 years at the princely sum of $150 a month for payment. There too, no car. I walked every day, pretty much 6-7 days a week in Illinois and Berea for 8 odd years to get groceries. Interesting experience. Berea College too, noted for its arts, and also noted for having a large proportion of its students from Appalachia. Berea College in Appalachia, and definitely so, stuck right smack dab in nature. And finally, it had many a crafts type oriented job for many of the students, carrying on the tradition. Finally, 100% of its students on scholarship, although maybe a few or more took out loans for things like a car, etc. Why do I consider West Point not a college? Well, I'll have to consult to my laundry list here of jottings, but I've thought of it a lot over the years, and so I'll give some ideas here. First of all, 100% of the persons there are on scholarship, shall we say. Today, the package is estimated to cost the government and taxpayers $500,000 for the 4 years worth. It might be higher now. At any rate, it was a bunch of hoops to jump through to get in, so to speak. I had a congressman vet me, so to speak, and a senator also as an alternate. You had to have one or both giving you a nomination. And they had a very select number of few persons they could nominate and have at an academy at any one time. Additionally, you had to take a physical aptitude test, which consisted of pull-ups, a shuttle run, and how far you could throw a basketball. And I remember working very hard at the local college gym with the students there who were college age, pumping iron, as well as a year or so beforehand too, when I lived in Minnesota earlier. And there were other aspects too, keeping charts of all this to show my progress to myself and motivate myself. I was not a stellar athlete in any other regard. I only had played golf. Also, there were the obligatory academic tests, SAT. There was another test. What was it? I can't remember. And then the ASVAB test I also took. Grades were quite obligatory to have at a significant level. I had all A's except for one B. And I got pretty good references. The references, the decent grades, and the creative bent, that all helped me. Violin, my achievements with the orchestra, and the 5 articles I had written and published in ham radio magazines and the monies that accrued over $500. Also, I had saved almost all of that until at the age of 16, I spent $600. My father contributed $200, and we went out and bought an $800 violin from a local Appalachian violin maker in a nearby town. Why more do I say West Point was really, in my mind, not a college? First, because there's a very low emphasis, comparatively speaking, on grades. After the 2-year point, you cannot leave without incurring some kind of financial obligation, but in turn, if you manage to meet all the other stringent criteria, you will have, quote, a job that pays a certain amount of money, so grades are much less of a concern. Secondly, there is much less emphasis on memorization as per the grades you achieve, and instead much more on mastery of what it is you attempt. And so this especially inculcated into their system of the physical training in the summers, in nature, and also in the confidence training and the required sports you train in all year round in PE classes. Everybody also required to play a sport after school all 4 years. I did all intramural sports, including soccer, 2 years. General MacArthur, I think he came in the 1940s heading it up there, had wanted and declared every cadet to be an athlete, in fact. My take now on that is that athletics in part trains for confidence, and there is no way to wiggle out of poor performance. And it helps one train for what's essential and what is fluff also. In essence, athletics promoted mastery and the feeling of achievement and recognition of when you have mastered something considerably. Also, most of the instructors there did not have PhDs. They received their training at a master's degree level after 5 years Army time. They did import, though, a few individuals who were civilians and had PhDs. Each professor then, or shall we say instructor, who was of the military dye or mold, had, generally speaking, always had a company command before even going to graduate school after 5 years in the active duty Army, and typically had had a company command where they led at least 100 men. That a little slightly different than your average professor then at a civilian, quote, college. Now, of course, the military being the military, it had its slant, including in military instruction classes. I would mention one lecture one day on what is a just or unjust war. The just war essentially is what you are told is just. Additionally, there were constraints. Additionally, West Point was really not your college environment in that nobody was allowed to own a car until their senior year. And then if you did, it had to be at one specific parking lot over a mile away. Additionally, anyone wanting to leave on the weekend had to obtain special permission called a pass, which you had to file for in advance with paperwork, and you were, quote, on leave to leave the grounds any weekend for any reason. Additionally, all 4 years you were not allowed to have alcohol in your room, and you could drink beer or wine at a designated point or two or at a specific party, maybe a company party, shall we say, on a Friday or Saturday night, chaperoned. And women, by the way, were a species only 4 years in the making there at West Point, 4 years before I came. And no women were allowed in your room if you were male, or vice versa, without the door open at all times. It was also forbidden for you to kiss a person or hold a woman's hand on campus, shall we say. West Point also had the honor system, and I will simply leave it at that. Also, all 4 years in the summertime, we had military assignments, often off the, shall we say, base of West Point itself. I remember one summer, for instance, I did something a little unusual and was a cadet drill sergeant at Fort Leonard Wood for basic training of regular people coming into the Army. I don't know the word regular, but at any rate, enlisted persons coming in, and I would sometimes be a drill cadet. That was a toughie because I had bronchitis all 6 or 8 weeks there in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Another summer, I flew out to Washington State and spent a couple months at a Corps of Engineer dam construction project. Additionally, there were no phones allowed in your room unless you were a club member in your senior year, and then for official purposes only. Otherwise, you would go down, in my case, 4 flights into the basement and use a telephone booth with coins. I remember calling my parents on many occasions with a $10 roll of coins. The first year or two, a cadet was not allowed to have a radio in the room. We did not have laptops all 4 years. Such an animal had not yet been created, and there were also no cell phones. Nobody also took any psych drugs, shall we say, tranquilizers or whatnot. And if you gained a few extra too many pounds and didn't get it off, so to speak, you would be processed out. Additionally, once a year, we had a very grueling obstacle course to go through and a physical aptitude test requiring, amongst other things, push-ups, sit-ups, and pull-ups. That was it, actually, all 3 of those. Quite stringent. Also, you were not allowed to be married all 4 years. I remember, in fact, my last summer there of the last year, I was assigned a roommate, and he told me a little secret. He said he had just come back to West Point to complete his time after 2 years as a missionary in South America with the Mormons, and he had gotten married there, come back to complete time, and now he was consternated because he was married, but that was a no-no. What was he to do, he asked me. Well, he didn't last long there, I will say. Another cadet once in my senior year said to me one day, "I have a problem. I ran across someone with a bottle of wine in their bureau. What am I to do?" In fact, I had one roommate. He was on the wrestling team, and he had been caught smoking marijuana, and he was processed out. He was allowed to come back a year later. And again, I would mention there were no laptops. In fact, I was the only individual on a barracks floor of 100, you'd call it a dorm these days, in a conventional college setting, to have even a manual typewriter. Other than that, no one else even had a typewriter. Other than that, nobody had any form of typewriter, let alone a laptop or word processing capacity. Encyclopedias, by the way, not available online, only in print format at the library. And so, this was quite an interesting shift compared to these days. We had no such animal as the internet either. I would mention that my interest in nature had also carried on then to time as a member of the West Point sailing team in the fall of my first year, and I won an award with somebody the second summer there at Camp Buckner training on the nearby lake, sailing. I will mention at this point that after 1 year at West Point, my grades were not very good as per going to medical school, and so I shifted to a major other than pre-med. That was difficult, and that had a great impact on my motivation. My grades were never quite up to snuff again there. At any rate, I did not let go of the dream of going to medical school until age 35. I would also just state that I was an unusual bird at West Point by way, I remember my first year there, of staying up till about 1:30, 2 in the morning on average, journaling and reading a news magazine. And so lights out was about 11:30. I would flip the lights out after this was checked on and march on. I had a roommate who was on the wrestling team. He was in bed by 9 p.m., getting his rest for the building, shall we say, of his muscles. West Point tried to beef me up in many a way. I don't know how or why. My first roommate was on the football team. Also, my squad leader of the second semester was one of the rare birds, the rare few cadets to have gone to ranger school during a summer period. And so I had the benefit of that in many a way, shape, and form. He also, by the way, was a civil engineering student and from Brooklyn. Then at the 3- and 4-year point, I was supervised and influenced strongly by a captain, later to be a major there, who was once with the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team before the Army, and in the Army at one point in time he had been in the Special Forces. And thirdly, at one point in time he had gone to the commanding general and gotten special dispensation to be one of 36 officers supervising cadets there to throw out basically all regulations that were trivial so that the cadets could focus on academics and other development. Throw out the regulations, that is, concerning demerits for dust, poor performance in Saturday morning inspections, and so on. This officer, by the way, saw that I needed a little sprucing up or more in the courage department in certain areas, and so he decided that he would ask and require, in fact, that I be a referee my second fall in soccer, not just as per my first fall, a intramural soccer player. That was quite challenging. The first game I refereed, I didn't know what I was doing on the field. After the game, called both team sides together, apologized, and really buckled down, learned the rules, and took off running, shall we say, from that point on in that department as a referee. This officer, by the way, saw that I needed a little sprucing up or more in the courage department in certain areas, and so he decided that he would ask and require, in fact, that I be a referee my second fall in soccer, not just as per my first fall, a intramural soccer player. That was quite challenging. The first game I refereed, I didn't know what I was doing on the field. After the game, called both team sides together, apologized, and really buckled down, learned the rules, and took off running, shall we say, from that point on in that department as a referee. West Point was also not a, quote, college. I maintain, by way of, for many cadets, if they were not on a varsity